Alex Streitberger has invited me to say something about the mise-en-scène of the body in my 1984 work, The Bridge, both as I saw it then and as it appears to me now in the light of what Alex has remarked on as the disappearance of the body in my recent work, Afterlife. Although separated by 35 years, the two works nevertheless lend themselves to comparison in that they've a common point of departure in the classical myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. I'll begin by recalling the context within which the bridge originally intervened. I say intervened. We tend more readily to use the word intervention of an academic paper rather than a work of art. In the case of the bridge, however, the word is apposite. My theoretical writings and my work for exhibitions have always proceeded alongside each other, but with, as it were, varying distances between them. These two strands of activities became most intimately entwined in 1984, when I produced The Bridge for the John Webber Gallery in New York, and gave my talk Diderot, Bat, Vertigo, for the symposium Film and Photography at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In the same year, I published the essay Tea with Madeleine in a special issue of the New York journal Wedge entitled Sexuality, Repositions, and gave the paper Man, Desire, Image at the Desire Conference at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London. The following year, I contributed works to the group show Difference on Representation and Sexuality at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. I recite this litany of titles to indicate that my writing and my artwork in 1984 converge in response to two topics of debate, one technical, the other political, most prominent in the visual cultural sphere at that time. On the one hand, the relation of the still to the moving image, and on the other, the representation of sexual difference. The debates around sexual difference that took place in the 1980s have today moved to a more emphatic focus on the critique of binarism and the contestation of heteronormativity under patriarchy. I don't intend today to give an account of these debates or the relation of my work to them. I'll rather expose some of the tributary interests that converge in the bridge but also feed into my subsequent work. As these sources are somewhat disparate, so my presentation must unavoidably incur some abrupt leaps in space and time. Early in my interest in photography, I began an essay with the observation, "It is almost as unusual to pass a day without seeing a photograph as it is to miss seeing writing." We may say much the same of narrative. Indeed, photography, still or moving, and writing, spoken or graphic, are the primary vehicles of narrative. Narrative is everywhere. As Lieven Gevaert remarked, like life itself, and such forms of narration as novels and films are only the more apparent features of a total and totalizing environment of tales. Nor is storytelling simply entertainment. What we call ideology is the sum of the stories by which we live, and the course of human history is determined through more or less violent struggles to own the narrative. I begin my essay, Diderot about vertigo, by considering the ways in which a still image may be set to narrate. My concern in the essay is less with what the story means than with how it means. The most obvious case of the transmission of a story through an image is that in which the image invokes a narrative that is already known. In this connection, I discuss Denis Diderot's conception of tableau and hieroglyph in painting and drama in relation to the program of history painting of his time. As the painter must show in a single instant that which takes time to unfold, then that instant must have a singularly privileged position within the total action. It was therefore recommended that the moment selected by the painter for visualization should be the peripeteia, that fleeting moment in the course of an action when all hangs in the balance. Here, in Sandro Botticelli's depiction of the story of the Judgment of Paris, Paris is shown in the moment he extends the prize towards the group of three goddesses awaiting his judgment in the contest between them. Botticelli arrests the prize giver at the moment when alternative futures open before him. In the very next instant, however, Venus will receive the prize, and the fate of Paris and that of his nation will be irrevocably sealed, committed to war, with Paris himself to be among the dead. Classical variants of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice agree that on the day of their wedding, Eurydice is bitten by a snake and dies. Orpheus descends into the land of the dead, and by the power of his song persuades Hades and Persephone, who rule over the underworld, to allow Eurydice to return with him to the land of the living. They impose one condition. As he leaves, he should walk in front of his wife and not look back at her until they both reach the upper world. But on finally seeing sunlight again, Orpheus impetuously turns to Eurydice, who had not yet fully emerged from the shadows. In the moment he sees her, she vanishes, this time forever. Here are three depictions of that moment. The Greek relief dates from about 400 BC and shows Eurydice parting from Orpheus as Hermes, the messenger of the gods, takes her arm to lead her back into the underworld. The engraving by the Bolognese artist Marcantonio Raimondi was made around 1509, and the work of the Danish artist Carl Guss was painted in 1826. The images demonstrate not only the historical longevity of the principle of the peripeteia, but also the historical persistence of the myth. The Pompeian fresco of the birth of Venus survived the catastrophic eruption of 79 AD. The depiction of the Danaides in hell, the daughters of Danaus, condemned eternally to fill a leaking vessel as punishment for having murdered their husbands, is by the 17th century French painter Nicolas Bertin, and Gustave Courbet painted La Source in 1868. George Frederick Watts depicts a seduced and abandoned servant girl in his 1850 painting Found Drowned. In 1855, Paul de la Roche paints a girl murdered for her Christian faith in La Jeune Martyre. What may be seen as historically enduring across such liquid images is not any particular narrative, but rather a persistent mise-en-scène of the female body in association with water. Julia Kristeva said that it is not so much the woman as such who is repressed under patriarchy, so much as maternity. That process without a subject, in Kristeva's words, that asserts the blind continuity of the species at the expense of the individual. A process marked by menstruation and amniotic fluids. Orpheus and Eurydice, woman and water. What I describe in Diderot about vertigo and stage in the bridge is the convergence of these two long-established mise-en-scène in Alfred Hitchcock's 1958 film Vertigo. The variant of the ancient myth filmed by Hitchcock has its modern antecedents in two novels. This drawing was made by the Belgian painter Fernand Knopf for the first of these, Georges Rodenbach's 1892 Bruges-la-Morte. The story tells of a man overcome by grief at the death of his wife. He lives a solitary life amongst what relics remain of her, letters, clothing, and a length of her hair, until the day he encounters a woman who could be his wife's double. His attempt to have his dead wife live again in this woman ends in tragedy. Although the frontispiece to Bruges-la-Morte is a drawing, the 35 illustrations announced on the title page are photographs. Bruges-la-Morte is believed to be the first work of fiction to be photographically illustrated. Rodenbach chose the photographs himself from two Parisian image agencies. They show a city consisting almost entirely of empty streets and motionless canals. If Knopf's drawing may evoke the figure of Ophelia, it may be because the ill-fated young woman in Shakespeare's Hamlet is mentioned in the novel. In this case, however, it is Rodenbach's male protagonist who feels called by a voice whispering from the waters. And if Knopf's drawing so readily evokes the figure of Ophelia, it is probably due to the wide familiarity of this image, painted in 1852 by the British artist John Everett Millais. For my photographic paraphrase in the bridge, the model adopts the pose of Millais' Ophelia, while her clothing, makeup, and wig are based on movie stills of Madeleine in Hitchcock's Vertigo. Bruges-la-Morte almost certainly inspired the 1958 novel D'entre les morts by Pierre Boileau and Thomas Nassajac, which reprises the theme of the return of a dead woman in the form of a living woman, with the difference that the male protagonist is a detective and the woman has conspired to deceive him. This is the work that Hitchcock directly adapted for the screen as Vertigo. I have identified two tableaux as converging in Hitchcock's Vertigo: the tableau of the myth and the tableau that associates the woman's body with water. These are joined by a third tableau, that of a typical male fantasy. When I first read a short essay by Freud called A Special Type of Choice of Object Made by Men, I was struck by the similarities between the syndrome of male desire Freud describes and the pattern of behavior Scotty exhibits in Hitchcock's film. The first condition, determining the choice of love object by the type of man discussed in Freud's essay, is that the woman should already be attached to some other man, husband, fiancé, or friend. In the film, Scotty falls in love with the woman he's hired to investigate, the wife of an old college friend. The second precondition is that the woman should seem to be of somewhat bad repute sexually. Madeleine the college friend's wife, suffers from a fixated identification with her forebear, Carlotta Valdez, whose illicit love affair and illegitimate child brought her to tragic ruin. The type of man described by Freud is, I quote, invariably moved to rescue the object of his love. And prominent amongst the rescue fantasies of such men is the fantasy of rescue from water. Scotty rescues Madeleine from the bay. Finally, Freud observes, I quote, the lives of men of this type are characterized by a repetition of passionate attachments of this sort, each an exact replica of the other. And he remarks that it is always the same physical type which is chosen. Following Madeleine's death, Scotty becomes obsessed by Judy, who physically resembles Madeleine, and who he sets about remaking into an exact replica of Madeleine. Hitchcock's adaptation of Boileau and Narcejac's story is set in San Francisco. In D'Entre les Morts, however, the story of the elegant Madeleine takes place in Paris, whereas the story of her unrefined double, Judy, takes place in Marseille. Paris conventionally associated with refinement, Marseille known to the French as la ville prolétarienne, the working-class town. Boileau and Narcejac map the difference between the two women onto the difference between two cities. In Rodenbach's title, Bruges la Morte, the definite article la may be taken as referring either to Bruges, the watery city of canals, or to the dead woman, or both at the same time. In Western representations since Greek antiquity, any space whatever begins with the body and is identified with it. The Roman architect Vitruvius urged that buildings display the same relations of parts to whole as is found in the human form. That the human body is seen as the origin not only of the building but of the entire built environment is apparent from the descriptions and drawings of anthropomorphized cities which appear in illustrated books during the Renaissance. In one such image by the 15th century architect and painter Francesco di Giorgio Martini, a body is inscribed in the plan of a walled city, with defensive towers at feet and elbows, and a fortress at the head. The navel marks the center of a public place, upon which is situated the principal church. Michel Foucault writes, "My body is bound to all the elsewheres in the world, for it is in relation to it that there is an over, an under, a near, a far. The body is the 0 point of the world. My body has no place, but it is from it that all possible places, real or utopian, emerge and radiate." We may consider a mise-en-scène of the body, in which the body is merged with and is indistinguishable from the scene itself. This is the way I approached the mise-en-scène of the body when in 1993 I was invited to make a work in response to Marseille, a port city topographically similar to San Francisco. My 30-minute video Venise alternates between the two cities and between the two versions of the Eurydice myth in Vertigo and D'Entre les Morts. I show Marseille as virtually empty, much as Rodenbach shows Bruges.
L'histoire commence lorsqu'un homme engage un détective pour filer une femme dans une ville. L'homme est une vieille connaissance du détective. La femme est l'épouse de l'homme. La ville Cela dépend de ce dont nous parlons, du livre ou du film. Le livre est d'Entre les morts, par Pierre Boileau et Thomas Nasser-Jacques. Le film est Sueur froide, d'Alfred Hitchcock. Un homme engage un détective pour filer une femme. L'homme craint que sa femme, Madeleine, ne tente de se tuer. Madeleine est obsédée par l'histoire de son arrière-grand-mère. Son arrière-grand-mère, alors jeune fille, s'était suicidée. Son portrait avait été fait très peu de temps avant sa mort. Dans le film, le détective regarde Madeleine qui contemple le portrait. Dans le livre, c'est le mari qui regarde. Il remarque comment Madeleine arrange ses cheveux à la manière de son arrière-grand-mère. Tout ce que le détective observe confirme la conviction de son client. Madeleine ne peut plus faire la distinction entre elle-même et la femme morte. Madeleine a maintenant l'âge que son arrière-grand-mère avait lorsqu'elle se tua. Madeleine se jette dans l'océan. Le détective la sauve. Ils tombent amoureux l'un de l'autre. Incapable d'échapper à l'emprise du passé, Madeleine se jette du haut d'une tour et meurt. Dans le livre, les auteurs écrivent « Elle était morte » et il était mort avec elle. La deuxième partie de l'histoire commence lorsque le détective voit, dans une rue de la ville, une femme qui ressemble à la morte. Le détective est obsédé par le souvenir de Madeleine. Il file la femme jusqu'à un hôtel où elle vit. Il la persuade de dîner avec lui. Bien que la nouvelle femme soit physiquement presque identique à Madeleine, elle se révèle différente en tout autre aspect. Madeleine était élégante et raffinée. Le détective trouve que son double est vulgaire. Il se met à transformer la femme en une réplique exacte de Madeleine. Il insiste pour qu'elle porte des vêtements identiques à ceux portés par Madeleine et qu'elle change la couleur de ses cheveux et les coiffe à la manière de la morte. De l'obsession du détective pour un passé mort, de sa détermination à la faire revivre dans un être vivant, résulte la mort de la femme. L'histoire se termine avec le détective, de nouveau, seul.
By 1993, identity politics had gained ascendancy over the topic of sexual difference in cultural political debates. In Venise, I show Marseille marked by a history of colonialism and the Holocaust. I begin the video with my own voiceover, then pass the narration to a woman whose voice marks her North African origins. The texture of the voice, le grain de la voix, in Barth's expression, provides a persistent material presence of the body in this work.
Elle se baissa, ramassa une fleur rouge tombée de quelques jardinières et s'approcha d'une tombe devant laquelle elle s'arrêta. Madeleine était restée 12 minutes devant la tombe. Elle était demeurée immobile, comme on peut l'être dans un endroit hanté de souvenirs, comme devant sa maison natale. Ils avaient atteint les quais, elle se pencha un peu. Elle avait lâché la fleur. La minuscule tache rouge s'éloignait lentement, tournant sur elle-même, balancée par le clapotis. Elle fit encore un pas en avant, paisiblement. Il modifia sa prise, et, d'un coup de rein, l'enleva, la porta jusqu'en haut. Elle était pitoyable, les cheveux collés aux joues, la peau marbrée. Ses yeux étaient ouverts. « Vous n'êtes pas morte, dit-il. » Il prit sa main, posa ses lèvres sur les doigts. « Ne regardez plus en arrière, dit-il. »
In D'Entre les Morts, the reference to the classical myth is explicit in the exchange that ensues between Flavier, the detective, Hitchcock's Scotty, and the newly rescued Madeleine. Boileau and Narcejac write, "Eat. It seems to me you like substance, reality. Eat, little Eurydice." She smiled. "You worry me with all your mythology." And at the end of a long moment, putting down her cup, she added, "Eurydice, how pretty that is. It's true that you've torn me from hell." In the bridge, the body is staged in its material reality, but only in order to figure the psychical reality of its doublings and repetitions across the intertextual field of Bruges-la-Motte, D'Entre les Morts, and Vertigo. The staging of bodies changes places as Bruges splits into Paris and Marseille to converge again in San Francisco. Bodies slide under names. Kim Novak plays Madeleine, who plays the part of Carlotta, who is Judy, formerly Renée of D'Entre les Morts, Jane of Bruges-la-Motte, and ultimately Eurydice. These exchanges of positions and identities, shifting associations and convergences, are the mechanisms of the unconscious that are the object of psychoanalysis. Such processes as displacement, condensation, identification, and reversal into the opposite. What the bridge stages, therefore, is not so much the body as a stable material entity, but rather the body as a psychical reality in process of dispersal across heterogeneous and shifting narrative fields. The body is inseparable, both from the stories for which it is the vehicle and from the spaces it inhabits. I concluded the talk I gave in Santa Barbara in 1984 with a fantasy about Padua, where I once visited the Giotto frescoes in the Scrovegni chapel. The frescoes tell the story of the redemption of man through the exemplary lives of the Virgin and Christ. There are also personifications of the vices and the virtues, and a large scene of the Last Judgment. Giotto's paintings tell the grand narrative of human existence in 14th century Europe. Close by the chapel is the church of the Eremitani, which in 1944 received a direct hit from Allied bombs. In my fantasy, however, it is the Scrovegni chapel that explodes, raining its fragments upon the city of Padua like the pieces of a huge Giotto jigsaw puzzle. As I write in Diderot about Vertigo, the grand narrative of human existence, the meaning of life, the source of inspiration and legitimation of all social institutions and individual actions, is not destroyed, but it is now encountered in a very different way, as fragments whose connections and ultimate meanings must be implied, construed, a material heterogeneity whose narrative ideological coherence depends upon a psychological investment. In Padua today, as in all our Western cities, this is precisely the way in which we encounter the grand legitimating narratives of our existence. The Scrovegni Chapel's totalizing environment of accumulated image frames has its counterpart today in our everyday environment of screens. In 1984, computers were beginning to make substantial inroads into domestic space. A decade later, the Mosaic web browser would popularize the World Wide Web, inaugurating the commercial exploitation of the Internet and the eventual emergence of social media. The proliferation of the stories by which we live has increased exponentially in the age of the Internet, as has concomitantly the body as subject and object of narration, and which is everywhere in pieces. This process of fragmentation may be seen as presaged by a change in apprehension of the body dating from the inception of modernity itself. In 2010, I was invited by the Musée de Picardie in Amiens to make a work in response to their collection. I found that their 19th century sculpture holdings include a plaster of Eurydice, and at the moment she's bitten by a snake. The work is by the French sculptor Charles-François Leboeuf, known as Nanteuil. French sculptors of the time would model first in plaster, then proceed to a bronze cast or marble copy, or both. Nanteuil's bronze today stands in Paris, in the Galerie Colbert, at the entrance to the National Institute of Art History. The marble is in the Louvre. Nanteuil exhibited the marble at the Paris Salon of 1824. The work is an exemplar of the neoclassicism most associated with the Venetian sculptor Antonio Canova. Supporting herself against a tree trunk, Eurydice reaches with her left hand towards her right foot, around which the poisonous snake is coiled. Some quarter century later, Auguste Clésinger scandalized the Salon of 1847 with his Woman Bitten by a Snake. The marble appeared to be based on a mold taken from a living woman's body, and the woman was recognizably the notorious courtesan Apollonie Sabatier. Her head is thrown back, and her twisted prostrate body is sinking into a bed of flowers. A bracelet in the form of a snake is sculpted around her left wrist. It might seem that from Nanteuil to Clésinger, the Platonic gives way to the erotic. But this is not necessarily how it appeared to 19th century sensibilities. Today, we accept that a sculpture offers a multitude of viewpoints to a mobile spectator. In the mid-19th century, however, it was held that a sculpture must be seen as an ensemble at first glance. On his visit to the Salon, the painter Eugène Delacroix complained of Clésinger's woman. One sees the entirety of her from nowhere. To form a complete picture of Clésinger's complicated woman requires an intellectual exercise, whereas the simple grace of Nanteuil's Eurydice is taken in at a glance, which then is more calculated to inspire desire. We might consider Clésinger as a harbinger of cubism, but whoever desired a cubist nude? These drawings by Pablo Picasso are all entitled Standing Female Nude. Of all the senses, the eye is the one that must hold its object at a distance, and from this distance the body is never fully known. The unified physical body is a psychological projection upon a fragmentary phenomenological field, a psychical entity which moreover may be involved by non-corporeal things. For example, the 1935 song standard, "These Foolish Things Remind Me of You," lists such disparate items as the winds of March, a tinkling piano in the next apartment, and a fairgrounds painted swings, as evoking the phantasmatic presence of the absent love object. It is this metonymically invoked body, rather than the body immediately before one's eyes, that inhabits afterlife. In common with the bridge, my 2019 text image book work, Afterlife, is anchored in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. But whereas the bridge foregrounds a male fantasy tableau that intersects with the myth, Afterlife gives prominence to the myth itself. The work, which also exists in a web-based form, consists of passages of images and texts orbiting the core premise of a parallel world in which technology provides perfect digital copies of individual minds. As I write in the book, once the duplicate is made, there are effectively two beings, one organic, the other numeric. Each evolves separately, but only one will die. The science fiction scenario serves as an allegory of everyday life, understood as a continual work of transaction between material reality and the virtual realities of memory, fantasy, and computer simulations. When I imagined the engineers of Afterlife designing their virtual world in the form of an island, I supposed they would provide a common place of entry for newly created digital avatars joining the parallel world for the first time. My first thought was that, like the port cities of Marseille and San Francisco, this place should be a seaport. But as my work advanced, it became an airport. It was only while reviewing the airport images I'd made that the memory of another Orphic film came to mind. Chris Marquer's short film of 1962, La Jetée, in which a man travels to the past to be with the woman he knows must be dead in his own present, and which opens with a scene in an airport. Some texts in Afterlife describe personal memories. Others evoke paintings, scenes from novels, or purely imaginary scenes. Such various descriptions are interspersed with passages of narrative and separated from each other by images and blank pages. For example, this passage from Afterlife is an exercise in ekphrasis, the written description of a visual work of art. This is the image that is described, but Edward Hopper's 1947 painting Summer Evening is not reproduced in the pages of Afterlife. The remembered painting is rather invoked in the form of a fantasy of the stage upon which Hopper's figures are about to appear, or from which they have departed. In a 1973 essay, Jean-François Lyotard writes, "Mise-en-scène is a general process, most often unconscious, which affects all fields of activity. One works to establish a limit between the real and what is staged. The mise-en-scène takes place on both sides. It is a staging that plays on the limit of the frame." This image is both literally and figuratively at the center of Afterlife. The woman in the photograph here stands in for the pivotal object, the Eurydice figure, around which my narrative turns. Corporeality is literally at the center of the image, in these knuckles, flushed with the blood that courses beneath the skin. The train might be seen as figuring passage in the Orphic myth, first into the underworld, then out. But where in the myth Eurydice follows Orpheus, here she is ahead. In the myth, Eurydice is dead, but here the photograph of the woman is the only live thing in a dead world of digital images. Staged bodies. La mise-en-scène du corps dans la photographie postmoderniste. The title of the current exhibition begins with a doubling in which staged bodies is followed by its French equivalent, la mise-en-scène du corps. Much like Madeleine and Judy, the expressions are closely similar but very different in implication. A closely literal translation of la mise-en-scène du corps would produce the staging of the body rather than staged bodies, thereby putting the emphasis upon the evolving process of staging rather than on the terminus of this process in the body that is staged. In Vertigo, the codes of classic Hollywood cinema are deployed to bring a linear narrative to dramatic closure. There is no such closure to The Bridge or Afterlife. Both narrate through the constellation of their parts rather than through their succession. They are paratactical rather than syntactical in organization. In both works, I take my model of narrative structure from the psychoanalytic description of unconscious fantasy, which evolves through the recursive mechanisms of the primary processes. As I've already remarked in Diderot but Vertigo, I cite a precursor of attention to such non-linear narration in the work of Denis Diderot. In his 1751 essay, Letter on the Deaf and Dumb, Diderot observes that the orderly progression of speech and writing is alien to the actual experience of thought. He writes, "Our mind does not move in stages, as does our expression." He finds, however, that the restrictions of language are overcome as language approaches the condition of poetry. Here, words may efface themselves by giving rise to images, the state of language that Diderot calls hieroglyphic. Here, he writes, language comes to paint thought by means of, I quote, a tissue of hieroglyphs heaped one upon the other. The Bridge and Afterlife are tissues of hieroglyphs, but differently so. In The Bridge, the body is staged in its material reality in order to figure the psychical reality of its doublings and repetitions across a relatively restricted set of texts. In Afterlife, the material reality of the body is all but evacuated and dispersed across a much enlarged intertextual field. The staged body gives way to the offstage body. The body mise-en-scène in The Bridge is mise-hors-scène in Afterlife.